Mic check.
A very good evening to everyone. We are all gathered here today to commence the celebration of Bharat Ka Amrut Mahotsav. Our first program under this banner is on the occasion of World Environment Day. Felicitously, the topic for deliberation for today's event is India heading towards a constitutional crisis, a climate change perspective? Professor Dr. Deepa Badrinarayana will be gracing us with her invaluable insights on the topic. As for another significant first, on this deemed occasion, we feel delighted to introduce our Honorable Vice-Chancellor, Dr. V.K. Ahuja, who is well known amongst the legal fraternity of the country. Dr. V.K. Ahuja, sir, has had a highly decorated career which encompasses various accolades and achievements, the list of which cannot be contained in mere speech. One of such accolades is where Dr. Ahuja had received the first prize in the 5th South Asian teaching session on international humanitarian law and refugee law, jointly organized by the International Committee of Red Cross, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and NLSIU Bangalore. Professor Ahuja also has a penchant for intellectual property rights and has published and edited several books and articles on this very subject. He has also delivered lectures on IPR in institutions across the country, and one of his lectures was also broadcasted on Doordarshan. Lastly, having been closely associated with other institutions such as Law Center 2 Delhi University, Lovely Institute of Law, and Institute of Company Secretaries of India, Dr. Ahuja has had substantial experience in the field of college administration as well. Without further ado, I would now like to invite Dr. V.K. Ahuja, Vice Chancellor of National Law University and Judicial Academy, Assam, to address the gathering. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much. Good evening, all the teachers, students, friends, ladies and gentlemen from India, and a very good morning, Professor Deepa Badrinarayana at United States. The world community has been celebrating World Environment Day since 1974 to address the pressing environmental issues. A theme is decided every year for Environment Day, and this time the theme is ecosystem restoration, which is very topical, very important. Well, friends, the time has come when we should make peace with nature. If we do not mend our ways and keep on destroying our ecosystem rather than restoring it, a heavy price will have to be paid by the generations yet to come. Various issues such as climate change, loss of biodiversity, livelihood of people, etc., may be dealt with effectively by healing the nature. And this is the high time that the entire world community should make honest and sincere efforts in this regard before it becomes too late. It is heartening to know that the fact that UN decade on ecosystem restoration is going to start from today. Each one of us must contribute our bit to ensure that there is no further damage to our ecosystem and the healing is done properly. I assure that NLU Assam will have many more activities, not only in academic terms, but also in practical terms on environmental issues to contribute in this noble cause. Last week, before joining as Vice Chancellor of this prestigious university, I inquired from the VC in charge, Madam Aparna, as to whether we are going to hold any event on the occasion of World Environment Day. And I was informed that a team of teachers, Dr. Deepti Moni, Dr. Ishrat Hussain, Dr. Saib Chaudhary, along with administrators and the students, I mean, whose name I do not remember, so they'll forgive me for that. They have already planned a webinar and they have invited a renowned scholar, Professor Deepa Badrinarayana from Chapman University, United States. Friends, I was glad for three reasons. Number one, that I was going to join a dynamic educational institution, that is NLU Assam, which is known for organizing enormous academic activities because I had already been a part of those activities. So therefore, my decision of joining NLU Assam was a very good decision. Secondly, a scholar is being invited from United States who is working on climate change from Indian perspectives. Though she is in United States, but it's very good to know that she is still working from the Indian perspectives. And the third one was, which was little personal, that the event was going to be organized at a time when I would take over the NLU as Vice Chancellor. So these are the three reasons that I was very happy for that. And friends, I'm not a professor of environmental law, and the madam who had given a brief intro about me, she had already spoken that I'm a teacher of intellectual property rights. So therefore, I would not like to waste much of your time. I would prefer to be a patient listener. And I congratulate the entire team of teachers, students, and administrators of NLUSM for taking this initiative to organize this event. And I welcome Professor Deepa Badrinarayana to address the audience on the topic, Is India Heading Towards a Constitutional Crisis, a Climate Change Perspective? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your speech. We wish you the best of luck as you embark on this journey. So we feel extremely delighted to have amongst ourselves our highly esteemed chief guest, Professor Dr. Deepa Badrinarayana. As Ahuja sir reiterated, Professor Deepa Badrinarayana is currently serving as a professor of law at the Daily Fowler School of Law at the Chapman University and is an alumnus of NLSIU Bangalore. Her area of expertise includes environmental law, law of torts, and comparative and international law. She has been closely related to environmental law and has also served as an environmental law fellow at the Center for Environmental Legal Studies at Pace University School of Law. She would be addressing us on this very topic and would be elucidating her own ponderings with us. She has corroborated the topic in her paper, The Emerging Constitutional Challenge of Climate Change, an Indian Perspective. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Deepa to address the gathering. Over to you, ma'am.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening. Thank you so much for taking the time today to commemorate an important day. The World Earth Day, interestingly, began during a period when there were no environmental regulations. And so it's interesting that we are now celebrating it at a legal intervention with regard to climate change. But before getting into the topic, I'd like to begin by first thanking the Bharat Ka Amrut Mahotsav committee for inviting me today to speak and address you. I'd like to thank Dr. Ahuja for his kind introduction. It's a very exciting moment to see another new national law school begin in India, in Assam. And I would like to especially thank Dr. Professor Basek, who has been in touch with me even before this particular conference was organized, and whose work. I'm looking forward to reading. His book is about to be published. And so I thank him as well for reaching out to me and inviting me to be a speaker today. So, and I thank all of you for having taken the time. It's 6:30. I know that, it's a difficult time, but still, I'm sure there are other things that you could have done. But thank you for joining in this meeting today. And also, finally, I hope everyone is doing well and that your family and friends are safe. It's really a trying time right now. And all I say is, we will all get through this. It's been very difficult here as well. In January, earlier this year, February in California. So hopefully, you'll see some improvement on the COVID situation very soon. So coming back to the topic, I'd like to do the following. So the first, I'd like to just talk a little bit about climate change. And I'm sure by now, even my young daughter can talk about climate change. Anybody can talk about climate change because it's become such an important issue. And it's also an issue that is, discussed quite widely and broadly. So nevertheless, I'll just introduce the topic of climate change generally first. Then I will talk about, some of the India-specific issues and statistics as to where India stands on climate change. And then I'll briefly mention, the role of or the place of Assam, although I'm sure many of you probably have a better sense of this. And then I'll move on to the international law framework and what are some of the challenges when it comes to setting out a rule of law framework or addressing climate change from the platform of law or from a legal perspective, and then talk about, the role of rights generally, but specifically about, why India is placed in such a difficult situation when it comes to addressing climate change and why this might be a challenge for the constitutional enforcement of rights, human rights and environmental rights in India, which is pioneered, right? The public interest litigation and environmental rights in the past. And I'll conclude with some thoughts on how we may probably go forward in addressing this problem, and also look forward to hearing some of your thoughts and comments and questions so we can generate a discussion that might lead to perhaps interesting thoughts and ideas that we can carry forward towards a productive set of actions that might emerge, right? So to begin with, on the question of climate change, as many of us probably know, the key issue is this, that the global atmosphere or the atmosphere that's around the Earth, right, very briefly, has become concentrated with greenhouse gases. It's a naturally occurring, phenomenon. So greenhouse gases have always been present in the atmosphere. What makes it a legal issue, what makes it a problem right now is the fact that these emissions have been added to by our activities, right? Anthropogenic or human activities that have increased the concentration. Of particular problem or of particular note is the problem of greenhouse of carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide concentrations have been added to the atmosphere primarily by human intervention or because of industrial activities and our activities. So the question is then, what does this do to the global temperature system? And very quickly and shortly, what this basically does is that it increases the temperature of the Earth, right? So the earlier phenomenon, therefore, was called global warming. And now we have the term climate change to kind of capture the complexities involved. But really what happens is that we have an increase in the global atmospheric temperature. So over a period of time, it results in a bunch of different consequences, one of them being melting of the glaciers, which in turn sets off certain feedback loops. And so we have increased absorption of the heat, and there's also less reflection of the heat back into the atmosphere. And the bottom line, I suppose, is that we are going to see those consequences of global warming or climate change manifest in our everyday lives, unless we find a way to slow it down and not let it continue at the pace at which we have triggered it by our industrial activities. So that's very, very, very loosely and very superficially the problem that the scientific problem of climate change, right? Something that was discovered quite accidentally, and as well as by observing certain consequences over a period of time. The question, of course, is what's the solution? In the past, when we encountered certain environmental issues, we had some solutions, right? So for instance, when it came to the ozone depletion problem, there were certain technologies to replace CFCs that caused the problem, right? So we were able to find a way to set out a phase-in period and say we have alternative technology. What we need is a time frame, and if we can put that time frame in, we should be able to, over a period of time, stop using or stop producing goods that will cause ozone depletion. So what makes climate change so much more problematic? Why is carbon dioxide so much more problematic? So as many of you probably know, the reason is just the economic model that we have in place, right? So what we have right now is a situation in which the global economy, for the most part, is a carbon-based economy. So it is really run by fossil fuels and other, coal and other sources of energy. So the question is, how do we turn this switch off, and what do we do? And I guess you come from a point of knowledge quite contrary to where I began a couple of years back, which is we have some technology by now. We have, for instance, solar energy, wind energy, and other biofuels and other forms of alternative energy that could be slowly introduced to replace the carbon technology or the carbon intensive economy that we have in place. But where did we go wrong? Why are we not here yet, right? So if you consider the timeline of this problem or the recognition of this problem, when you see the timeline in terms of the recognition of the problem, what you see is that, earlier, few countries were in a position to do something, right, including the United States. And so the question is, since many of these countries knew from the 1960s, there's new litigation that is occurring right now against some of the fossil fuel companies such as ExxonMobil here in the United States. And what the document review have shown is some of these companies knew about the problem as early as in the 1960s, right? But they chose not to address the problem. In fact, quite to the contrary, they chose to hide the problem or, underplay the problem. And why is that? What's the reasoning behind this? One of the reasoning, of course, is vested interest, right? So if I were a company whose job was to produce fossil fuels, I wouldn't want that to close down, right? There's so much writing on it. But the bottom line is that's the reason why we saw a lot of slow progress on climate change. And two, of course, from a cognitive perspective, unless we see the problem, it's very difficult, right? It's human nature not to address certain problems unless they become evident. And climate change is one of those problems which may now be more evident, or the problems of which may be more evident. But really, even now, we don't see it. We don't see things happening at a pace or even on a scale that will make us act immediately, right? Say we have to do something about it right now, right today. So, and there might be other reasons as well, but these are some of the reasons, at least two main reasons why action did not occur initially. The other problem, of course, is the differences in the economies of the world. So let's just kind of jump back to the 1990s, right, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was negotiated, or the preparation for negotiations of which began. So we can, if you look kind of at a snapshot of our history, political history, in the 1990s, we saw the emergence of economic liberalization, right? Global economic liberalization. So we began as a world on a totally different note. We almost rebooted the world from one that was divided based on different economic ideologies to one where nations agreed to trade and liberalized trade liberalization and trade liberalized economy, right? So the result was, the focus was on trying to see whether we could make the earth flatten the earth so that all nations could develop, right? Could develop, and those poorer nations or developing nations would have an opportunity to catch up with the developed countries. Of course, the question is, what does that mean? What does development mean? Development, in pure economic terms, would mean more industrialization or more growth along a certain economic model, which means more production, more consumption. So an economy that is highly dependent on environmental resource extraction, right, and use. So the result is, in the 1990s, even as the scientists, right, had drawn our attention to the problem of climate change and its consequences, we were on a different path as a world. We were on the path to start a developmental project, or start a world developmental project where every country would catch up, right, and become developed. And it was, it was an important project, right? Let's admit it was an important project, because how do we solve the problem of poverty, right? So that's a separate topic in itself, right? One that may not be even addressed in today's meeting, or in some of our lifetimes. But the big point is here that the result is that even though countries agreed to address environmental issues, including climate change, it was equally agreed that developing countries would have the opportunity to develop. And also, we started with a very difficult ethical problem, and that ethical problem is that some nations had developed, some nations had actually used the very model of development and resources so that they could develop on a large scale. The question was, could the others develop without access to the same kind of modeling, the same kind of use of natural resources? And the answer, of course, is no, right? We don't have an alternative model of development, or at least a model of development that is not so resource intensive or environmental resource use intensive. So the result is that even though nations acknowledged we have a problem, even though nations agreed, they actually negotiated a United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that acknowledged that climate change is a problem, they also set out the parameters for actions as follows. One, the developed countries that had actually contributed to much of the problems, which was evident by their level of emissions, it would be up to the developed countries to take the lead. Developed countries would have to take the lead in terms of establishing a legal framework, in terms of providing the finances, and also in pioneering the technology. Developing countries would just have to cooperate, right? Would have to cooperate in the process and do the best they could to address the problem. Now, of course, what happened, right? What happened, right? From that point forward was as follows. Think about this, right? You liberalize the trade, you liberalize the economy. So what happens? What really happened with that? A lot of industries could actually move out of, say, developed countries, let's say United States, for instance, and move to those countries where there were not many regulations. They could actually move to China. They could actually move to India. Now, over a period of time, what else happened? It meant that, a lot of production and then industrial processes started taking place in those countries where governments were not bound under an international agreement to reduce emissions, right? They were not bound really to reduce emissions, because we had agreed as a world that, developing countries need to develop, and therefore we are not going to require them to reduce emissions. So from a legal perspective, where did this leave us, right? What happened from a legal perspective? From a legal perspective, this meant that you had a huge loophole, right? You had a huge loophole. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but climate change is a problem, right? To kind of reiterate, is one that is clear, one that is evident. There's enough science, right, on this particular issue. But on the other hand, the legal framework is not quite where it should, or the basis for action was very divided. But the problem is very present. right? So if you look at the statistics, since the negotiation of the UNFCCC in the 1990s, global emissions concentrations have been steadily growing. They have been steadily growing every single year. And we are now at a point that scientists call the tipping point, right? We're very close to that tipping point where we may not be able to reverse this trajectory, that we might actually have entered the Anthropocene, as they say. Many believe we are in the Anthropocene, where we may have to start relying on adaptation mechanisms, because mitigation of climate change by reducing emissions and reversing the path towards global warming has that window has closed. So we may actually have to move on to adaptation mechanisms. And when you look at the problem from different countries' perspective, where does India stand, right? So India is in this unique position. Dr. Ahuja mentioned, right, that I work on India here, and that's because this is something that my work in environmental law started in India, and so it's something that I'm very, very, very passionate about, and it's close to my heart. So where does India stand on this, right? So I've actually seen the problems in India. I grew up in a period where maybe some of you have seen this too, but I grew up in a pre-trade liberalization era. So I kind of have seen an India that was very different from the India that you have today. That's very much developed in an economic sense. I grew up in India where there have been water shortages, and I know they still exist, right? I come to India every year until this COVID happened. My family is in India, so I very much know what the problems are in India when it comes to the economic development, when it comes to poverty. It's not something that you can just talk in a theoretical manner. It's a very real problem. But equally, right, what I have learned over the couple of years is the following: that in India, the number of people who are vulnerable to problems such as climate change, when it manifests, are also very large, right? We have a very large population who will not be able to protect themselves from climate change. So this puts India in a very, very difficult position, right? On the one hand, it's a country that needs to develop, because it's a very real need to make sure that people have basic resources, electricity, right? I'm sure, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I grew up when some days you didn't have electricity for a day or two in the summer, and you just, went on. It seems okay as a child when you go through that. It's almost romantic. You think about it and you say, well, I didn't mind it. But I'm sure as an adult, and if you have other needs, it's not so nice to say, I just don't have electricity at all. It would be, a critical utility to have. So on the one hand, India has a very real need to make sure that resources are used in a way that you can develop and provide these basic needs to people. On the other hand, if climate change is not reversed, or the pace of climate change is not reversed, we are going to see huge impacts. So in the Himalayan belt, we'll see people's life being impacted tremendously. If the glaciers melt, as they have begun to, we will see both water shortages on the one hand, and we'll also see flooding on the other hand, right? So we are going to see tremendous impacts on the ground level that will affect thousands and millions of people. And I'm sure, in Assam, you will feel the same impacts, probably very direly, right? Assam is a belt known for its rainfall. But what will happen if that rainfall pattern is affected over a period of time? TERI India has a very interesting report that kind of sets out what are the Assam-specific impacts. And the government, of course, has already started working on different aspects of this. But the bottom line is, what we have is in India, both as a country and in particular some states that need to develop, but that have this tension of high vulnerability. So the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank Corporation, HSBC Bank, prepared a report in 2018, right? And that report focused on some of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change. And India was among the top 10, 15 countries. In fact, many of the countries that would be vulnerable to climate change are all in the Southeast Asian region, right? So there is a real problem when it comes to addressing climate change. But unfortunately, maybe because of this tension, but we know there are other reasons, right? Different vested interests playing in on such a complex issue. There hasn't been adequate progress in taking this, managing this issue and taking it forward. So, for instance, following the UNFCCC negotiation or the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the next step was to kind of finalize the details, right? So nations agreed it's going to be developed countries that are going to take the lead. And the question is, what is the framework? And there began the problem. Kind of jumping back to my earlier point, the question was, how do we come up with a legal framework that will, on the one hand, balance the interests of developing countries, right, with the need for action, and also ensure that developed countries acknowledge and take on the burden of solving the problem, since they contributed a lot to this problem. And so there began, the tug of war. So on the one hand, United States particularly said, we're not doing this alone, right? If you look at the negotiation of the first treaty pursuant to the UNFCCC mandate, the first mandate was, let's come up with a protocol that will set out what's the legal obligation of all countries. So they said, let's divide up the countries into, Annex A countries that will have, or Annex 1 countries that will have obligations to take the lead on this, and the rest of the world that will cooperate. And so in that list, when you had a short list of countries, United States said, we are not going to do this. And we're not going to do this because, what's in it for us? Particularly since China is developing so rapidly. India is also developing rapidly. So these countries are going to be the future big emitters. And so we are not going to put our economy at risk and lose our competitive advantage if there is no obligation imposed on these countries, right? And of course, China, India, and to some extent Brazil, South Africa, and Russia kind of kicked their heels in and said, well, we need to develop. So don't look at us to provide any kind of, legal framework or to accept any form of legal obligations. We are going to cooperate, but you have to provide the means that will, enable us to cooperate. So as a result, for almost, 10 years, 1997 to 2005, right? There was a lot of wrangling that was taking place in regard to the Kyoto Protocol until Russia agreed to ratify the protocol, and it came into effect. And it was, by then it was very clear that it would be ineffective. Now, some of the mechanisms that were introduced under the Kyoto Protocol, notably the Clean Development Mechanism that would fund developing countries' projects to introduce solar energy and other renewable energy, for instance, have, were important interventions. And we still see that there's a development of alternative energy that's continuing in India and some of the other countries at a very rapid pace to address climate change. But from a legal perspective, there really was not a binding agreement that would require countries to meet certain emissions reduction obligation. And from that point onwards, from Kyoto Protocol onwards, a lot of international negotiations focused on ensuring some form of action was taken, but it kept getting watered down until we came to the Paris Agreement, at which point countries agreed that they're going to voluntarily submit their commitment, right? They would nationally determine their commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This wouldn't be legally binding, but it would be a honor-based system where you would make a commitment and then go back and take action internally to address the problem. And that's where we are right now. Now, the question is, what's the constitutional problem, right? Where's the constitutional issue here? And the constitutional issue is as follows, right? Many of the people out there, whether it's in India or other parts of the world, have come to a point where they feel, when climate change happens, right, when it actually happens, and it will probably happen, because look at the state of the affairs right now. In all likelihood, we are going to see climate change manifest. Our rights are going to be affected, right? What happens when climate change occurs? We're going to see unprecedented rainfall. We are going to see loss of livelihood. We're going to see loss of property. And, we agreed constitutionally to protect these rights, right? We agreed that, we believe in these rights, at least in some societies. We did agree to this. So what has happened is that there's been a huge shift from allowing nations to solve this through collective bargaining to actually litigating. So many groups and individuals in many countries have started approaching the courts, and they have started asking the courts to provide remedy. One popular approach has been youth plaintiffs, right, or litigation by youth plaintiffs, where young people go to courts and they say, you are actually, not protecting our constitutional rights, right? And some of you might be familiar with the public trust doctrine, and that's also a framework that has been introduced, stating that, the governments should treat our atmosphere as part of the public trust. And so they should protect it per the principles of the public trust doctrine. But they are failing to do so, right? They're failing to actually protect our atmosphere as their duty requires them to. So the movement to actually talk about climate change as a rights-based issue has gained a lot of traction. And there's a lot of there are a lot of cases that have been filed over a period of time. And at least in some jurisdictions, notably in Holland, and more recently in Australia, courts have been willing to say, there is a duty here on the part of governments to protect the rights of their citizens. And it is high time that they actually made a commitment that is meaningful, right? That's meaningful. And so the remedy that they've been providing is not very specific. The remedy is that they're directing the states, the governments, to do something more. In some countries, for instance, in Pakistan, the litigation has focused on adaptation, right? So instead of litigating to enforce a right to mitigation, youth plaintiffs have required the courts to ask the government or direct the government to actually publish adaptation plans so that they can make sure that something is in place to protect the rights of youth when climate change occurs, right? Now, where is India in all of this, right? Where is India in all of this? Coming to the core of this topic that I was requested to speak on. So a couple of years back when I started working on climate change, my starting point was the Constitution. For those who are not in the first year class, you probably have, if you have taken a course on environmental law, you have probably all visited the constitutional environmental rights cases in India. And in India, of course, that has been a very important starting point. Even though we have legislation on environmental issues, we have environmental legislation, we have regulations. What has been very, very important in India is this, recognition that the right to life is not just the right to live, but includes or encompasses a bunch of rights, right? A bundle of rights, and included in those different rights is this right to environmental integrity or environmental protection and health protection, right? That's also part of this right to life. And I think, it's a very, India is well known, right? Renowned globally for that jurisprudence and that jurisprudential innovation where they actually did away with some formalities, right? So the way a petition should be submitted, the way who has standing to go before the court. And I think that was a tremendously important step where the Indian judiciary went from a point of formality, right, to substance. And I think it's a very important step because I think the Indian judiciary understood that in a country like India, where many people wouldn't even know that they have certain rights, right? Just have no opportunity to kind of sit and say, let me think, is my right affected, right? Because many people would basically be struggling to just have one square meal a day. right? Many people who didn't have the resources to actually, think about what are my rights, how do I pursue them. So I think the judiciary really recognized that, the rule of law requires intervention that goes beyond this formal requirements to substantial aspects or so, and so we have a judiciary that has pioneered this right to life, allowed public interest litigation to be filed just by writing a letter or the court suo motu taking cognizance of a particular issue. But when it comes to climate change, where does our constitution feature, or where does it stand, and what can our judiciary do? And when I started looking into this question, I found myself torn. Like I said earlier, I grew up in India. I have family in India. I have friends in India. I go to India on a regular basis. So I know what the problems are, right? A lot of resource access problems. And it's not simply, you can't simply turn your face and say, you know what, it's okay. You'll be fine. We just have to do something about this problem. You understand that the right to life, to include environmental protection or health protection, is complicated, right? It's a fine balancing act that requires us to look into it from different perspectives. So I asked myself this question. Let's assume there's a litigation, right? Let's assume that we go to the courts and we tell the judiciary that climate change has a number of impacts. There's going to be increased temperature or rise in temperature. There's going to be sea level rise, and eventually the impact is going to be felt by people in different sectors and in different locations. They're going to encounter extreme weather conditions. They're going to encounter situations in which there will be flooding, and there will be high heat waves, right? A high number of heat waves. There's a recent report that actually has found that due to global warming, heat waves are actually killing more people, have been killing more people. So let's say we present this evidence to the court and say, it's very real. Climate change has real impacts on the lives of people. So their right to life is going to be affected. It's already being affected to some extent. What do we do? So the question comes back to the beginning starting point, which is, who is causing all of these problems? Who is the defendant here, right? So one way of defining the defendant would be to say it's the government, right? Which has happened in some of the litigation right now, human rights litigation, and especially in a constitutional claim. What are you going to say? You're going to say the government is not doing what it needs to do to protect the rights of the people, which is bring down emissions. Now, the problem, at least a couple of decades back, and I think it's still a problem, is that, and this is something the judiciary in different jurisdictions, including in the United States, have said. They said, but the government is not emitting, right, uniformly or exclusively all the greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gas emissions is a global phenomenon. Different countries have inputs into the atmosphere. So how can we give a remedy that is focused on a particular government if that is not going to help the situation? I think this is a political question. It's a question of foreign affairs, right? So it is something that governments need to address. It's not up to the judiciary to address, even if we recognize that the rights of people, of Indians, will be affected, right? That they will face, severe health impacts and environmental impacts, and those impacts are actually, rights protected under the Constitution directly or as interpreted by the Supreme Court of India, right? So there's that first problem. Can, even in spite of having recognized environmental protection as a part of the right to life under the Indian Constitution, can the Indian judiciary actually provide remedies? And if so, what would that be, right? Can they direct the government to negotiate a treaty that is different? And we haven't had many cases that talk about the scope or discuss the scope of, powers vested in the judiciary to direct, right, foreign affairs or foreign matters. It is generally well accepted that that is a matter for the political branch, and therefore it is not a matter in which the judiciary can actually have a lot of intervention. And so, even even in spite of a very forward-looking judiciary, what we see so far is there isn't been any traction when it comes to enforcing or getting a judicial judgment, right, judgment on a right right to climate protection in India. But at the same time, there is no denying, right? If we go back and look at the data, if we start collecting the data, there is no doubt that climate change is in fact impacting people tremendously, right? Their rights are being affected, will be affected en masse. So this is why I think the organizers put in this topic, right? The question, do we have a constitutional crisis? Have we reached a point where the foundational rule of law, our constitution, is unable to address a problem that is going to affect millions of people's rights? And if so, how do we go forward from this, right? There's some hope when you look at certain decisions, such as the Australian court's decision that came out just a couple of days back, right? Barely a week old, and also the Netherlands court decisions, where these courts are saying, the governments in those countries have a duty, right? They have a duty of care, because any action initiated by the government, even if it is to reach outside of their jurisdiction, even if it is outside their jurisdiction, is going to impact their people. So for instance, an Australian court has held that there should be in on export of coal, because even if that coal is going to be used outside of Australia, it's going to affect the global atmosphere, which in turn will affect Australians, right? So that's one way to look at it, that really the action must develop in countries where a lot of the resource extraction has been taking place. But that is not enough. So this, right? So far, in all of these negotiations, climate negotiations, the position of China, India, etc., has been, and I think it's a legitimate position. I don't dispute that. But the position has been that we have a right to develop. We have a right to provide for our people, right? So you need to address, or those who created the problem initially need to address this. But I think that stance has to be strengthened by also equally taking another stance. And that is, we have a duty under the Constitution to protect the right of our people from climate change. So what we need is not just a recognition of the right to develop. We need to move beyond that. And that takes tremendous amount of leadership. And I'm not sure if that leadership will be supported, right? It's easy for me to talk about it, but really, if you look at the scope, scale of the problem, we really need to come to a point where we need to start thinking about this. The judiciary cannot really provide a remedy here. The best that the judiciary can do is direct the government to take action to, put in place emissions reduction policies, programs, as well as adaptation policies. But the scope and scale of this problem is so huge, it is nothing like the earlier cases where the judiciary can set up a committee and ask the committee to follow through and follow up with government action. This is going to multiple levels. It's a multi-scalar problem. And it is also going to require the government to really start thinking, what does it mean to protect the rights of our people from climate change? What does it mean to ensure that on the one hand, we provide the resources to make sure that people have the basic needs that they require, but also ensure that their rights are protected. And I think, as a corollary to that point, I'll add that I think it is perhaps time for, us in India to start thinking about not just the right to life, but also the other right that has been less focused on, which is the right to equal protection of the law, right? So there is a constitutional right to equal protection of the law in our constitution. So maybe we need to start thinking about that, right? That environmental justice or climate justice, right, broadly, is not just bringing to all people certain taking place at the national level, right? So we can't have just a few people enjoy benefits of development happening to India. The scale in some countries like India might be large, but the problem is not unique to India. Environmental justice or climate justice is a problem that we find in every jurisdiction. But I think this is, moving beyond the right to life. We want to also start thinking about, what is an equal protection of the law mean? How would we frame policies? And the Indian government has done a tremendous amount of work in the past few decades in introducing alternative forms of energy, solar energy, for instance, notably, right? But I think the leadership that is required now is also to demand more from international negotiations from a constitutional perspective, right? That's one thought. The second thought is, I'd like to hear from you. I know I've spoken at length, and it's probably not easy to, listen to all of this, especially over the internet. So what I would now, welcome any thoughts from you, and I'll stop there. And I'll once again thank everyone for your time today, for taking the time. And it's been my absolute pleasure to share some of my thoughts and forward your make sure that my, talking about electricity, etc., that my computer is connected to the power line. So give me a second and I'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I think that should take care of it.
Thank you so much for delivering the lecture, ma'am. I think I speak on behalf of the entire meeting when I say, oh, that's great, ma'am. But I think on behalf of the entire meeting when I say that your lecture certainly gave us all some food for thought, and that said, as you announced as well, I'm sure all the attendees would also have some questions in store for you. Turned on. If you're facing any logistic Law University and Judicial Academy Assam to moderate the session.
I think the volume is off.
Good evening, Honorable Vice-Chancellor, sir, Professor. What are the ways in which the recently proposed environmental impact assessment violations of the constitutional provisions, madam? The parliamentary debates aspect and the aspect on the environmental impact assessment violations that has taken place. That is the first query being placed. Thank you, madam.
Thank you. So I must admit that my knowledge of the parliamentary debate issue is very limited. I would actually, if anybody else has information on that, I would really like to hear more about that, right? I've been reading on this, but not, don't have very much knowledge. With respect to the EIA impact, I've been looking at the new law, and one of my responses has been as follows, that, in the United States, a couple of years back, when there was hesitation, or there was, reluctance to commit to a climate change agreement, and even to, adopt a climate legislation nationally, the judiciary was approached to recognize within the EIA a right to, or at least the inclusion of climate impacts assessment specifically. So, it's kind of a tangential, broader answer, right? But I would say that, at a point such as this, we should be looking to strengthen environmental impact assessment to take into account climate impact assessment. And I think a change of the EIA laws at this point, as has been proposed, would, should be considered from the perspective of the Constitution and the right to life under Section 21, and to kind of see whether it strengthens and promotes it as opposed to dilutes it. And I think it would be, and I think it's also, very important to make sure that the regulatory structure and regulatory bodies in place that can actually make an assessment are empowered to take into account environmental impacts and issues, as opposed to having the discretion to cursorily, dismiss some of the, challenges that have been raised. So actually, it's in my list of projects to actually study the EIA law closer this summer. I've been following it up to some extent. And so I'm afraid my answer is not as satisfactory on that, but I'd say very broadly from what I have studied so far, I think we need to start evaluating and looking into strengthening the EIA process at this particular point, as opposed to diluting it.
Thank you, madam. The next question in consideration is regarding a gender perspective, madam. So the question is that, can a gender adaptive study in consonance with Article 14 and 21 of the Constitution, can that be used effectively to address climate change? A gender adaptive study, ma'am, in regard to the constitutional provisions with regard to environment.
That's a great question, right? It's a very great, interesting question. One that I hadn't actually specifically thought about, but now that you raised the question, you'll know that in Switzerland, right? In Switzerland, a litigation was brought, claiming the right to, environmental protection. And interestingly, it was brought by a group of women who listed, how climate change would affect them in very specific ways. That was very gender specific, right? How it would actually, women having different sets of issues, how climate and change and temperature would actually have a greater impact on them. It's not something that has been, very broadly pursued, of course, but I think, whoever came up with that question, I think there's at least an article or a short opinion that I think, you should write up and publish it. And I would look up this, this case in Switzerland. I forget the name right now, but I think if you look up, Google just, Switzerland climate litigation or climate rights case, you'll easily, pull up the case. And I think, if you look at that as a starting point, even though I think that case, last I checked, I think it was pending, but I don't know if it's been dismissed since. But I think that's a starting point, because yes, right, gender rights and how women are going to be affected are going to be very specific and different when you consider it in the context of the overall population. And I think, if you look at what's happened with COVID, I don't know the statistics in India particularly, but I'm sure that, there might be at least somewhat similar statistics to some extent. But in United States, one of the, big challenge that has emerged is many women, lost their careers and kind of, stepped back by a couple of years, right? Decades, apparently, because of climate change, because the society was not, the infrastructure to support them just wasn't there, right? So I think there are gender-specific issues that can be raised. Now, when it comes to environment and India and gender, I think one of the questions we can ask is, what will happen to women who are in charge of resources, who may have to walk, many miles to get water. What will happen if there's water scarcity? What will be the burden that will be placed on women? What will happen to their to the kind of burden that will be disproportionately placed on them when it comes to managing various resources, right? So I think it's a great question. Yeah.
Yes, well, the question is very imperative because a large portion or huge percentage of women in rural India are actually dependent upon environment for their livelihood. Very
Yep.
pertinent. So the next question, ma'am, with regard to the health crisis in India. So considering the current health crisis being faced by India, what are the post-pandemic challenges that India is likely to face with regard to the health crisis due to climate change, ma'am?
Yeah. Oh, what a great question. Again, another, fantastic question there. I've been thinking also, right? Like I said, I have very close friends and family in India. So right now, I'm following what's happening, back home in India very closely. And, it's been hard to kind of understand, to kind of see this unfold, right? I think we have prided, at least I have prided, India as a place with a lot of, good doctors and, efforts to make medical or make inroads into medicine, generally speaking. But now I think, what we are seeing is we just have not focused so much on building a medical infrastructure. There are rural areas, especially where, people have no access to medicine, and that we are really not prepared to address a crisis, right? A crisis that I think was evident. COVID, unfortunately, was a crisis that began, last December. So there were a lot of signals that this is a crisis that will require at some point a lot of medical intervention. Now, just to be kind of a little balanced here, every country has struggled with it, right? Every single country in the world has struggled with the medical infrastructure. But I think there is an important lesson here. Like I said earlier, adaptation is something that we have to start focusing on at this point. Many scholars think that the window for treating climate change as a problem of mitigation has actually closed, that we have entered the Anthropocene, and we are now at a point where we have to start thinking about it as an adaptation problem. And I think the COVID crisis, and I've been thinking about what lessons we can learn from this pandemic. And I think the COVID crisis tells us that, we have to be prepared for the worst. And the worst is probably worse than what we can probably conceive, but at least we must try to think about what was missing. I think one way to go about it, and maybe this is something that, NLUJA can do, is to kind of do a post-mortem and talk about what were the failures, right? What were the different failures that occurred? What kind of regulations could possibly strengthen that, those failures? Where was the coordination? What kind of laws needs to be in place to make sure that we have, procurement in crisis and emergencies? There are process in place. It's a huge question. Again, thank you for the question. I cannot do justice to that question except to say that I think that's a lot of work that's out there to kind of pull apart the lessons from the pandemic and try to look into what are the future rules and laws that we can put in place to make sure that there's more agility to deal with emergencies.
Thank you, ma'am, for the reply. Another question in regard to the extension of the adaptability measures only. So the query is that there is a lack of political will, and that seems to be the main obstacle for the environmental change in India. So in that regard, do you believe that adaptability measures are the only way to go about?
Yeah. Okay.
If that is the query.
Great question. I think again, even I would say political will has been a huge problem when it comes to environmental issues generally, right? Everywhere in the world, right? It's really not something that happens automatically. So when I first came to the US to study environmental law, I had a very, I guess, I don't know if I had a different perspective, but I kind of said, okay, they have addressed this problem. There must be something, different here. The politicians must be more willing to address this problem. But what I've learned over the years is that, it's been a fight everywhere in the world, right? You've taken, when the problem becomes so important and imminent, that people start feeling, we need something to be done about this. If not, we are going to be in trouble, right? We are going to just lose our rights. At that point, they push back, they create the political will. And I think that's really important, especially in democracies where people would have to, shape that political will. So it's a challenge because on the one hand, political will basically at some point is influenced by different interests, right? So there's an interest in, let's say the industrial sector wanting the government to allow resource use, and the government is pulled on the one hand in that direction. And then you also have, people saying that, no, we have different needs. So where does it leave us now when it comes to political will? Is it that we are left with adaptation? And I must say I'm very cynical maybe in saying this, but I think the question is actually whether we will even see political will to help with adaptation, right? Or set out an adaptation plan. So when it came to the litigation in Pakistan, the question was whether or not the government had violated constitutional rights of youth by not, publishing an adaptation plan. And the court found that, I believe the court found that, the government had, a constitutional duty to publish those plans. So, I don't know if it's an answer, but I would add to your thought by saying that, we will still have to find that way to push that, nudge that political will, even when it comes to adaptation, right? It's not, even that cannot be taken for granted. But I equally believe that, whatever room there is to shift towards a more energy friendly, right, or an alternative energy, renewable energy policy, I think there's still room to influence the governments on that front.
Thank you, madam. And because of the quality of time, the last question with regard to the session is that, ma'am, we have many pressing urgencies of the steps that are being taken at present, and some of them are compulsory and binding with regard to the environmental protection, ma'am. So how are these going to be achieved while at the same time respecting the sovereignty aspect and the right of self-determination of the nation states, ma'am? Especially for a country like India, where millions of people are, still languishing poverty, ma'am. So in regard to the measures being taken.
All right, so this question, raises another favorite topic of mine, right? I had written on this broadly a couple of years back, right? So, I would go about answering it as follows. So when I started reading or looking into climate change and environmental issues broadly, you do see that one of the, as you've rightly recognized and identified it, one of the problems at the international level is this principle of sovereignty of nations. And it's a very important principle which has its own historical roots, right? And so I would not say anything to diminish the importance of this concept of sovereignty. I think it's very, very, very critical from an historical perspective. But I will also ask this question, right? Which is, where do rights then figure, right? If you look at the international law system we have in place, it is state-centered, right? It is state-centered. And I think what that means is there's an implicit assumption that states, right, that the states will actually represent the interest of their people in the international forum. So the sovereign authority or power that states have has the responsibility or comes with this responsibility for states to represent their people in international forums. So when it comes to climate change, what we have to ask is, have sovereign nations done that adequately, effectively, sufficiently, right? And then the answer, if you look at the Constitution, coming back to our whole discussion today on the Constitution, is, well, as policies stand today, will rights of under Article 21, right? And 14, is that going to happen? And if that's the case, then the question is not whether sovereignty is important. The question is, what should be the place of rights in international law when sovereignty principles are not adequate to make sure those rights are represented? So it's not a question, but I think it's it's not an answer per se, but I'd rather say it's an observation that we are at a point where we need to think about international law itself and the role of states and the role of people from the perspective of constitutional rights. And whether we can change that is a different question. But I think every change begins with an idea. So I think that's where I would leave it.
Thank you very much, madam, and thank you for the participants for the questions and the madam's responses, which have definitely added a further comprehensive dimension to the areas of the discussion that we had on constitutional crisis, a climate change perspective, because it brought about the areas of gender perspectives, health issues, more particularly in the pandemic issues, and regarding the issues of poverty also in India. Thank you, madam. Now I would hand over the session to Aditya Trivedi. Thank you so much. Thank you, madam.
Thank you.
So much, ma'am. I'm Aditya Trivedi, a member of Bharat Ka Amrut Mahotsav Committee of National Law University and Judicial Academy as well. Thank you so much for answering those questions. It was a very interesting session. And I also thank Kasturi ma'am for moderating. Good evening to one and all present here in this event. It is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks on this very important occasion. This has indeed been a very enlightening and insightful engagement for all of us here today. I must, on behalf of the organizing committee and the National Law University and Judicial Academy Assam, express my gratitude to our extinguished resource person, Dr. Deepa Badrinarayana, for taking time out of a busy schedule to deliver such an important lecture and for engaging and interacting with the participants and responding to their important queries as well. We are extremely grateful to you, ma'am. We look forward to such intellectual engagements with you in future as well. This program would have not been possible without the invaluable guidance and encouragement from our Hon'ble Vice-Chancellor, Professor Virendra Kumar Ahuja, sir, who has joined the university very recently and yet mentored us in all possible ways to make the program reach a wider audience and make it impactful. We are extremely thankful to you, sir. In fact, I would like to make this note that we received 1,500 registrations and more than that, and people have been watching us from YouTube. And people who are watching from YouTube, please fill the feedback form for the purpose of certificates. I would also like to extend my gratitude towards our respected registrar, Dr. Indranoshi Das ma'am, for always being there guiding and encouraging all of us in successful conduct of this program. I must thank Dr. Nandani Chaudhary ma'am, Assistant Registrar, NLU Assam, without whose support we would not have been able to conduct this program from the confinements of our home during this lockdown. Thank you so much, ma'am. I would also like to thank Dr. Kasturi Gokul ma'am for moderating the event with such efficacy, expertise, and tactfulness. And our environment law professor, Dr. Chiradeep Basak sir, for all his help in coordinating with our distinguished speaker. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. I'm extremely thankful and grateful to all the esteemed dignitaries, participants, and seniors and the students who attended this particular event for their meaningful engagement. This would not have been possible without you all. I would also like to thank the Honorable Convener of Bharat Ka Amrut Mahotsav Committee, Dr. Deepti Barua ma'am, faculty member, Dr. Ishrat Hussain sir, Dr. Sahib Chaudhary sir, faculty member, for the invaluable guidance and the willingness to always navigate us through difficulties. Thank you so much, ma'am and sirs. I would like to thank our IT staff for helping us with the technical aspects of conducting this webinar. Thank you so much. But most importantly, this program would not have been possible without the hard work, dedication, and youthful spirit of our student members, Deepika, Agnev, Avesh, and Agnev, and all other associated members whose name I am not able to take here due to time constraints. A shout out to all of you. You have worked long hours without much rest for the successful conduct of this program with the limited resources at our disposal. Thank you so much, all of you. And thank you so much to one and all for being here. Hope to see you again soon in future. Stay safe and take care. Thank you so much.